will be refreshments afterwards. I think this is it. The stage is yours, Andreas.
Thank you. Thank you. So, my name is Andreas Bergström, and I'm the Deputy Director at Forus, which is another liberal think tank, also part of the ELF family. I also used to be on the board of directors for ELF. So, for the last few years, I worked a lot on those issues. I've been one of the editors of a book that you can find at the back there. It's a green book there called Machines, Jobs and Equality, also published by ELF. So I'll talk a bit about some of the things in the book. It's several chapters there. I won't cover it all, not all. And I'll also talk a bit about some things that are not in the book, that are more actually about gig economy, sharing economy, and so on, that it's actually not covered in the book. But things that we have discussed a lot we've had several workshops within this project as well. So both workshops in Swedish and workshops, ELF organized workshops, where we discussed those issues. So the starting point of this project for us was automation. How is it changing the economy and society? And you get a lot of buzzwords and automation, digitalization, which isn't exactly the same. Unemployment, people are talking about that, rising inequality, the internet, the sharing economy, decreasing prices, low growth, actually a bit surprising. Usually when you have technological change you get high growth, but now you have low growth. And education is often mentioned as a possible solution. And I'll talk about a couple of those things. There are more things in the book. One of the main things we discussed is, are the jobs disappearing? Because this is what you always hear in those discussions. And a starting point for that was a paper from 2013 by two economists called Frey and Osborne. And this is not easy to understand, and with no need to get into detail here, but they did a study where they concluded that 47% of the American labor market had a high risk of automation, high risk of people getting out of employment. And this really, I think you've seen it probably a lot in different versions, that in 20 years, half of all jobs will be gone, things like that. It has been quoted a lot. Well, the problem with this was that what they looked into was the technological possibilities of automating jobs. That doesn't necessarily mean that you actually do it. I mean, you can automate everything that happens at McDonald's. People have actually built robots that can put together the hamburgers at McDonald's and so on. Why doesn't McDonald's use that? Well, for an simple reason. It's actually cheaper to hire young people to work at McDonald's and flip the burgers manually than to use those robots. And also the robots aren't very flexible, etc., etc. So that it might be possible to automate a lot of things in the labor market. But they're clear themselves in this paper that this doesn't mean that it actually will happen. It just means that there's a possibility for it to happen. So it's really been overrated a lot. And also, if some jobs disappear, as they surely do, as they always do, the labor market changes all the time, other jobs appear. So the question is, are we seeing something new here where jobs are disappearing? And a lot of, there's an American discussion here, which is very much colored by the statistics, that in America, after the financial crisis, the blue line is the US. As you see, employment went down, and it didn't really get back after that. So there's a big discussion in America that there's something happening here. It might be because of automation, or something. Some people say it's clearly because of automation. Now new types of jobs are being automated, and we can't really replace them. We're heading towards like a divided labor market where some people can't find a job and others make a lot because they own big companies. But if you look at other countries that are equally automated, I mean, Sweden is here, Austria is here. Sweden is clearly, I mean, we take pride in being like in the forefront of automation and digitization. And we have record high numbers when it comes to employment. Austria has great numbers as well, and actually the whole of EU, the green line, is actually at quite higher numbers now, higher employment rate now than before the crisis. So, I mean, if automation caused people to be unemployed, why do we see it only in the US, not in other countries? So there is actually a lot pointing towards automation being a problem in the US, because if you do state-by-state comparisons, you can see that in those states where lots of jobs are automated, you see the biggest problems. So surely, but you don't see the same pattern in Europe. So it's not something inherent in automation. It's rather something about the American labor market or maybe American education system, and I won't go into details there. But it's clearly not the case that the automation we've seen so far is taking jobs away, net employment. I mean, the net employment is actually going up. So surely lots of jobs are disappearing, are automated, but there are actually more jobs appearing in the labor market. So I think that's an important start, but it still means the labor market is changing a lot. So what's happening all over OECD countries, so rich countries, developed countries, is that jobs in the middle of the, if you look at the competence, if you look at wages, jobs in the middle are disappearing. Typically like industrial workers, but also like somewhat less qualified white-collar workers. Those jobs are disappearing, while low-paying jobs and high-paying jobs are increasing. So what we see is what is sometimes called a polarization of the labor market. And we're used to actually that the labor market has higher demands for education. This is like a traditional view that the more technology advances, the more education people need. This is actually not what's happening here. What's happening here is that the low-paying jobs, which actually have very low formal qualification requirements, they're growing, and also the high-paying jobs, which then might have high demands, skill demands. So it's a bit of a new development that we see here. So there's much more about this in the book, much more about how this affects equality, but I won't go into more detail about that, because I want to talk a bit about this that I think will be more like the main topic of tonight. Sharing economy, gig economy, and platform economy, also those buzzwords. My view of it, this is not in the book, this has been in the workshops we've had, discussions about this, that gig economy, that's, I mean, it's basically from the music industry. You do a gig, you play somewhere for a night, you get paid in money or beer, and that's it. It's one night, and then you do it somewhere else next, and you negotiate a new contract for every time. Typical gig economy, but I mean, a lot of services are usually like this. Also like hiring a carpenter for doing something in your apartment or whatever. So it's nothing new, really. Then you have a platform economy, where you have digital platforms where you can in some way conduct business or meet new customers, whatever. So Facebook is an important platform, App Store is an important platform, and so on. And there's an overlap here. So there's a lot of new gigs that take place because of the platforms. People can find each other via those platforms who wouldn't otherwise have found each other. And then you have the sharing economy, which is when you share some sort of physical resource, which might be environmentally friendly, might not, but often it is. So, for example, car sharing, a carpool, is a typical example of sharing economy. Uber is not actually in the sharing economy. Some people want it to be seen that way, but it's really a taxi service, because you don't generally just happen to drive around a bit, do a bit of Uber stuff. I mean, generally you have a car because you want to drive for Uber. So it's actually more of just a traditional job. So, and a lot of the sharing economy is growing now thanks to the platforms, where where it's much easier to find someone to share things with, car sharing services and tools, share tools and so on. those are some platforms. This is the App Store, the Apple App Store. Klarna is like a payment system for e-commerce sites. It's Uber, it's Airbnb for housing. It's Alibaba, who sells things from Chinese manufacturers to everywhere. And what happens is that those tend to be a bit monopolistic. So they tend to grow a lot and take up a lot of space. And generally, we liberals don't like monopolists. But at the same time, they tend to foster a lot of small companies around. So what's sometimes called micro multinationals. So even a very small company can, thanks to those platforms, suddenly be multinational. On Airbnb, you can easily rent out your apartment to anyone in the world. Chinese small manufacturers on the Chinese countryside can easily sell to people everywhere in the world. They would never have been able to do that, to find those customers without Alibaba. So you see monopolistic tendencies at the same time as you see the birth of many small companies. So that's interesting, I think, a new development. Those companies are born out of the globalization. The global economy is like their playground. At the same time, they give more globalization. They are like the platforms for more global trade. When it comes to prices, they really tend to give decreasing prices because there's more market efficiency here. You can it's easier to find a supplier with a low price. At the same time, they tend to create more business opportunities. So lower prices, but many more business opportunities. You can make more money even though the prices are lower if you're a supplier or producer. So I think a quick regulatory response to those new platforms and new services is important for two reasons. One is that if you have the right regulatory framework, it's obviously positive for business and growth. If you have a good regulatory framework for e-commerce, for drones, for like Uber, for whatever, you will have those businesses in your country, and that's good, of course. It's also important because it might lead to new startups. You might have a first mover advantage. A country that has a good regulatory framework and is adapting this framework to the technological changes can be the country where startups want to set up the business or where companies want to move their headquarters. So there's a big advantage there if you have a quick regulatory response. So what should we look at for those regulatory responses? One is you should avoid defending the status quo. There are always interest groups, for example, taxi drivers, who want the market to be as it always has been. They don't want new competition. You should stay clear of this and think of the economy as a whole. And that's easier said than done. You should let size and frequency determine regulations. I mean, if there is a business that does big business all the time, then it might be reasonable to put on a lot of regulation here and say, you're pretty much the same as the old sorts of business. You do it on a platform, but it's really the same as earlier. If it's something small, I mean, if it's someone renting out their apartment once or twice a year, a few days on Airbnb, maybe you wouldn't like to have all the regulations that apply to a hotel service, for example. So really, you should look into the size and frequency and see if maybe you can have different layers. Maybe, okay, this qualifies as a hotel with all the safety regulations that there is for a hotel. And maybe this is like nothing. We won't even care about it if you rent out your apartment for 1 or 2 days. And maybe there's something in between. So you have to find those proper regulatory levels. And we talked about in one of our workshops about the toolbox approach, that all those different platform services and so on, and the sharing economy, it's actually quite many different services. You can't have like one process that applies to all of them, one regulatory framework for all of them. But you can actually, if you develop a good regulatory framework for one service, then you can probably reuse some of those regulations for another service, because they are they are like family. They have some certain traits in common. So you can reuse, you don't have to invent the regulations from scratch for every new service that appears. You can reuse, you can have a toolbox that you use all the time. Another thing that has been discussed is unions for self-employed. So I think maybe we'll get more into those things about labor market, the situation on the labor market for people who are self-employed, who sell services on platforms, etc. I won't go into details about it here. Taxes has been discussed. Should we see those as people selling services on platforms as companies? Are they employees? For example, a driver for Uber, is that an employee, or is that person self-employed in his own company? Or maybe somewhere in between. You might want to find other solutions, special solutions. There is a risk for tax evasion here, absolutely. It's easy to do business on those platforms, and a lot of people obviously don't pay taxes when they rent out their apartment on Airbnb and so on. But actually, in the end, eventually there should be a possibility of more control here. I mean, it's all done via a digital platform where everything can be traced, everything can be, all information can be collected by a tax authority if you have a good cooperation with the tax authorities and this app or whatever. So we shouldn't worry too much. We should rather see that we find good digital solutions here. Integrity is, of course, important here also. And there is not like a one-size-fits-all solution here, again, but there must be an ongoing debate. Whenever there's a new service, how should we regulate integrity issues here? There can be a lot of personal information on Facebook, for example, Google, etc. So you must have an open, ongoing debate about this, finding the right regulations. There must be an openness about who sees what. Today, I think quite a lot of people are unaware of where the information you have on Facebook, where it ends up, who can see it, who can't see it, etc. There must be an openness about that, because otherwise you can't really have an informed debate. And who watches the watchmen? If there are people who get a lot of information because of those platform services and so on, and someone keeps track of all this information, who keeps track of people who keeps track of you? You should always have to think about that. And that was the end of my, I think I had 10 minutes, so I tried to keep it short. So I think there's a lot more in the book, and there will be a lot more in the panel discussion, I guess. Thank you.
Invite the speakers to join me on the panel. Thank you very much for your very interesting introduction, Andreas. I think that was very good, very detailed. Not detailed enough. So I won't go into further. Without further ado, I'd say we'll start right away, and I'll introduce the speakers first. To my left, I've got Martina Dlabajová. She's been a member of the European Parliament since 2014, and she's also the vice chair of the Committee on Budgetary Control and a member of the Committee on Employment and Social Affairs. So you'll know about all of these issues, and also about the role of the European Union. And you're second vice president of ELF, if I remember correctly. And I'll skip you since you've already done your introduction. Niko used to be a NEOS MP and a speaker for startups, media and digitalization. It's also with full background knowledge about the subject, I'd say. Niko brought Vice to Austria. and he took over the commercial and organizational management of the new research platform for Vadis Veritas. I'd like to start maybe with you, Andreas. You spoke about we need to have more solutions. We need more quick solutions for the current situation. What are the solutions? So what would be, say, your three main ideas for the big solutions for regulatory framework when it comes to digitalization?
I mean, I think part of it is like the meta solutions. It's not like, oh, you use those three guidelines and you'll be home safe with any new service that appears. I think you should have to see that trying to stay ahead, trying to see what is happening, the technological changes that are happening, and always thinking that it's a very quickly changing world out there, and you have to stay flexible and always be ready to change regulations when there's new technology. I think that's really the number one. And then after that, if I have to have three, maybe I guess it's possibly this open debate about the integrity issues, because I think that might really otherwise lead to backlash for many of those platforms when people understand that their information is used in ways they didn't really realize or never actually.
So data protection in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important in the long run. And then third, I don't know, maybe I should just say two. Those are the two most important. I mean, otherwise you saw my presentation. There were several others, but those are probably the two most important things.
All right, thank you very much. Niko, could you quickly elaborate on the situation in Austria? Why is it troublesome? Is it troublesome at all when it comes to startups, to regulations? What would be?
Very troublesome when it comes to startups and employment, because the market is regulated, but then again the regulations don't really apply or don't really stick. And one of the big problems we have is that we don't have a good separation of self-employment and employment. We also have a third type of employment, which is, I can't even translate it, via Dienstnehmer. It's like free employment or self-employed employment. That's
kind of freelance.
No, that's freelance would be self-employed, in my opinion. And that distinction is made in theory, but not in practice. So many people work self-employed. They invoice companies, and then like social security and tax authorities, they come and tell companies that these people are actually not self-employed, but actually they are employees. And that does have a huge impact on many companies, especially new companies and especially startups. And there's various types of work that is being done in that companies that's really in the first phase of building a company, where you can't really tell whether these rules should apply that strictly that we already have. And even if that's the case, you don't have the legal security, or you can't be sure that that this isn't changed afterwards. So that's one of the big problems. And also there's a few regulations that make it really hard to foster innovation, so to speak. We do have a problem to bring new products and services into the market as quickly as possible. Innovation needs a certain type of speed, and many companies can't keep up with the speed to reach, to be ready for market in time because of these regulations. That I could elaborate now, but maybe we can do that a little later.
Let's do that a little later. Martina, what about the role of the European Union in all of that? What about the regulatory framework when it comes to the EU? Is it transposed adequately according to you? Where does it lack in substance, maybe?
Well, there are different things. Good evening, first of all, to everybody. I'm happy to be here in Vienna with you. Well, first of all, I think there is really a delay between the fast digital revolution and between the potential regulatory framework we could give. And this is one of the biggest problems of us politicians, that we would like to regulate everything, but with the digital revolution, we are very in delay. We would need to be as fast as innovation, as fast as digital revolution, but we are not. And so sometimes what happens is that we just stop and we avoid innovation and we avoid the fast revolution. And this is what I see with Uber, for example, as well, that in some countries, some cities, the reaction was very negative. Let's stop it and then we will see. But I think that our rule would be to be as quick as innovation and try really to find a solution for innovation, because we will not stop the innovation. But what is very positive, all these topics are absolutely very high on the list of current agenda of priorities of the European institutions, of all institutions. So this is very good, because on one side we are aware that single market and internal market in European Union has too much to be done yet. It's not accomplished yet, and the digital single market is something which is on its way. But on the other side, we are aware of the risks, and I think that what we should do to translate these risks in opportunities. So we should find really to be a little bit more positive, and sometimes maybe avoid kind of populism, which is going even around the digital and innovation topics, which you would say, okay, what kind of populist can be there? But there is a kind of populist. There is a fear of jobs we can lose in the future. The informations are not given right. There is no evidence which is given. There are just like ideologic thinking. So we have to be very careful about it.
I think the whole topic comes with a lot of fear. If you look at the taxi drivers and the situation of Uber, for example, I can very much understand their situation, their concern when it comes to the competition by Uber. So in terms of regulatory frameworks, what would you, is there any way, if you say we should avoid populism, is there any way of how to alleviate the situation and kind of by using law diminish the fears?
Well, you know, maybe because I was in business before joining the politics, I like to do politics based on evidence and based on data. This is why I welcome very much this kind of debates, this kind of studies and books. Thank you for that, because we really should base our decisions on evidence. I have a very concrete example of the last week. I'm from Czech Republic, and in Czech Republic we are starting, as well in any other country in European Union, a big process with Digital Alliance, Industry 4.0. We are looking at other countries who are already doing something. And for example, last week there was a big forum between Czech Republic and Germany. Germany is still our biggest trade partner, so of course Czech Republic is looking at Germany as the biggest trade partner, and there was this exchange of best practices, what can be done in different countries to regulate digitalization, automatization, Industry 4.0. And there were a lot of journalists, a lot of ministers, and one thing which was said, and I was sitting in the first row, so I know exactly what was said. One thing which was said, there are different studies. There are not concrete data yet, because some studies say that 10% of jobs will disappear because of digitalization, and some pessimistic studies say that 53% of jobs will disappear. And then we were talking about opportunities, about creation of new jobs, what we can do, what are the concrete examples, cooperation between education system and employment, and so on and so on. Then after the conference, I arrived to the airport to go to Brussels, and the first thing I saw was the big screen of Czech television, where was a big title, because of digitalization, 53% will disappear. 53% of jobs will disappear. This is not giving right informations, and this is something that we should avoid, and it should be avoided both by politicians and both by media. So this is what I'm saying. We should base all our decisions on evidence, looking at the real facts, and seeing what are the possibilities, and we need experts for this. We need people really working in the sector, and we need to listen to them, and not decide to stop Uber just because we are afraid of it. Not decide to stop innovation because we are afraid that we will lose jobs. So we have to look at the evidence.
I'd say we have kind of an expert here on that topic in a way. What about Sweden, for example? How's the situation there? Is it kind of more going into a best practice scenario? You said employment did go up.
Employment is high, I mean, but employment is actually rising and high all over Europe. So I think we've been a bit pessimistic about. We've seen that the US has so much better labor market, and Europe is so inflexible and so on. But actually, in the current development, they are doing somewhat worse than before, and we are doing somewhat better than before. So maybe we're doing something right in Europe, actually. Yeah, it was
Sweden.
Sweden. Well, so I don't think Sweden is. I mean, sure, yes, we have a very high employment rate, but we've had high employment rates for forever. It's mostly due to many women in the labor market. So that's not really because of technology or anything. Things are working well, but I mean, I don't see Sweden as a good example when it comes to regulations. I mean, Uber, for example, Uber has tried two different things in Sweden. They have this, which is really a regular taxi service, which is working fine, no problem, because they follow all the standard regulations for taxi service in Sweden. And the taxis are actually quite, it's not very harshly regulated in Sweden compared to many other countries. It's a quite open market. Then they tried this really extremely liberal solution, if you want, where the drivers could actually be anyone. They didn't really have any taxi driver education or taxi driver license. They didn't really have a taximeter in the car, because they said, well, we don't need a taximeter because, I mean, it's all in the app. If the tax authorities want to know anything, they could ask us. Well, what happened was that actually they put all the responsibility for paying taxes on the drivers, and most of the drivers were more or less newly arrived refugees who didn't know anything about Swedish tax law, so they obviously, for that reason and for other reasons, they didn't really pay any taxes. This was somewhat a disaster, and all the taxi drivers were dragged to court and so on, so it was obviously a personal disaster for a lot of those people who didn't really have any much money to begin with. What you would have wanted then was trying to find a solution here. I mean, they did have a point there. That why should you need a taximeter? The information is all there. But on the other hand, then of course Uber should give that information to the tax authority, or at least, I mean, the proper information. Maybe not all personal information, because maybe you don't want the tax authorities to know exactly when you went where for each individual. So I mean, there should be a possibility to find a solution here, but the government wasn't at all interested in that. I mean, what happened was those drivers were dragged to court. They all lost their cases and had to pay taxes, which they couldn't pay, and that was the end of that experiment. We have added other things like that as well. So we're not at, I mean, Sweden has quite liberal regulations on the whole. It's an entrepreneurial country and so on. But we're not really progressive when it comes to finding smart regulatory solutions to those new technological developments.
Austria isn't the best practice example
yeah,
either.
Austria isn't very smart either. Yeah, one question: Did Uber then stop the service in Sweden, or just the Uber Pop service?
The Uber Pop service.
Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
They stopped that. So the normal Uber is.
Yeah, we don't have that here either. So Überpop doesn't exist in Austria, but at least Uber operates in Austria, heavily regulated, and they tried to even regulate it further in order to protect the taxi services, of course. And of course, this is just one example of protectionism that doesn't work. It's only delaying the change that is about to come. And we experience that in almost every other field that's usually mentioned, like Airbnb. The same thing is happening. Airbnb is happening all over the place, and you basically can't stop that type of service. And again, of course, it also needs some sort of regulation, but it's usually going in the wrong direction, because politics very often think that it needs more regulation on those new services instead of going the other way of deregulating the existing services. It would help a lot more to alleviate the regulations on regular taxi services, regular hotels, and bringing about change in already existing traditional companies. Also, I mean, you have funny headlines like in Germany, somebody wanted to regulate online trade on weekends, so that Amazon would have to close down on Saturday evening and Sundays, which of course is nonsense, and just illustrates the way that these people are thinking, that they can sort of change the way the world goes in all other places except their own neighborhood. So very often it's a matter of ideology, like you said before. That basically politics, or some parties in politics, they do have the wrong point of view, the wrong mindset, and they should, we should actually. The thing is that the basic effort we need to have here is like change the mindset in what can we actually do to make it easier without taking away securities and protections where they are needed, and that very often doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I just have maybe even some questions, but what was very interesting, what you said before in your presentation, was about the possibility of more controls. Because the digital world and all this new way of working give us, I think, more possibilities of controls. And this is what we really need, because why we want to regulate something, why we politicians want to regulate something, because maybe there is some abuse. And we need to have a control, we have to have enforcement. So we don't need to change rules, but we have to control these rules. And I remember the first time I organized the meeting in the parliament with representative of Uber Europe, with Czech members of the European Parliament. All of them were afraid, and this was like the fear number one, which was not mine, that the taxi drivers will not pay taxes, and the Uber will not pay taxes. So I explained them that there is even more control. Because I see, like now I gave money to a taxi driver in Vienna. I don't know what he is going to do with this money. Okay, it's not like a concrete taxi driver, but you never know because you give money cash. But with Uber, you just pay through the application and everything is digitalized. And what they did in Estonia, they just connected the application with the tax office. So it's somehow easier, and it's even easier way of working. And I see this problem now. We are discussing a lot in Europe mobility in general, and problems with the the truck drivers through all Europe. So the best solution there will be tachograph, which is a digitalization of their work, and there could be like a real control of these rules. So maybe this could be a direction we could go. What do you think about it? Because this is what we need in the future.
I do think about that a lot, because that also involves, of course, data protection. I mean, we do have more potential control, yes, but it doesn't mean that we necessarily have to exert that control right from the start. Also, that's the approach that I think the city government of Vienna has. Hopefully I'm not talking or relaying the story wrong, but I think their idea for Airbnb was that Airbnb transferred all data basically to the financial authorities so they could keep track. But this actually, I think that's the wrong way to go. I think Airbnb does have the data, and they should probably, there could be some sort of data retention, maybe in an encrypted form somehow, so that they should keep it for some time, but not transfer it beforehand. And I think that's a huge difference. That you have potential control, but you don't really make it all too transparent, because I think we have to be very careful with that. I don't know how it works in Estonia, but I'm not sure if we should like skip the trust in honest companies altogether and just make them too transparent in the first place. I think potential control might be sufficient in the first step.
When it comes to, it's been mentioned before, a comparison between the United States and Europe in a way. And there are scholars who say that the employment protection regulations we have in Europe, which are quite different from the situation in the US, are one reason why we have a, say, maybe stifled innovation scene or not as a blooming startup scene in Europe. So is it, do we, if we go in that line, do we have to choose between a regulated labor market and a startup scene, or is that too far-fetched?
I think it is. I think the labor market regulations we have cause certain problems in the dynamics of the labor market, but I don't think when it comes to startups and those really innovative companies, I don't think they are the ones that are most affected by the labor market regulations. It's most like, for example, an industry that needs to change, needs to lay off some people and hire new people. Sure, they might have a problem with it, but those small startups, they usually like go under the radar. They are not really affected much by this. So I think, I mean, when it comes to startups and so on, I think it's more because of, well, generally several European countries still have lower educational standards, lower educational levels than the US. We have generally, I mean, we have lower incomes. We have the European economy per capita is smaller than the US economy. I mean, you have to remember that. And also, of course, the language problem. It's really a union of different countries with different languages. That means you don't really have one big, I mean, we have, I mean, in the regulatory framework, if you look at that, I'm sure, I mean, in many ways, actually, the EU is more united than the United States. People see the United States as one market. It really isn't. They have state requirements that really can differ quite a lot between the states, but they have the same language. They have more or less the same culture all over, which means it's a much bigger market, which is very good for a startup, for trying out new things. You can grow in that enormous home market and then expand internationally. In Sweden, for example, I mean, it's 10 million inhabitants. It's really a quite small market to grow in before you have to go out on the international stage.
Yeah, when it comes to that, I think even though we have the EU and we are all members of the EU, we still have that cross-border challenge in a way, which is a big part.
Exactly, as I said even before, we are working, and I think that it's still for all of us like the biggest advantage of the European Union to have one single internal market. But of course, the internal market started in '93, and there is still too much to be done. And just the two things we are talking about right now are very good examples of what can be done more. It's a labor market, because we still have, of course, 28 labor markets. We don't have one labor market. So this is why there are still struggles of mobility and some cross-borders cooperation and employment. So that's one point. And the digital market as well. We don't have still one digital single market. And if you look at the examples, the startups you were talking before, they were very successful in US because in last years they were in digital sector. And if you imagine Skype, which came from Estonia, sorry for mentioning Estonia a second time, but it's just example, Skype had to start the activity in the US because in Europe would need 28 licenses to start. So this was like a big difference of the approach. So you just think twice as a new company. Even if you are very innovative, you don't want 28 licenses. You want one for a big market, as they did in the US. So what we should really do is to complete this digital single market, to think very well how to complete it. And this will be a very good step forward. And what concerns the startups and the freelance or even people who wants to put their own skills on the market as a freelancers, I think this is something that we should really encourage in Europe. We should look forward in this because both new companies and startups and both freelancers, they can create new jobs. And this is what we need to do. So this is something that we should look at. And very big issue will be, and there I would like to know your opinion as well, with these new alternative work contracts, new alternative work arrangements. This will be a very big challenge, because I must say that the independent contracting, the modern, which are facilitated by modern technologies, by digitalization, will very quickly displace traditional employment contracts. And unfortunately, some of my colleagues, politicians, they see this as a negative thing, and they call it precarious contract, precarious employment. And I see it on the other side as a big advantage, a big opportunity for the future, to have this alternative employment arrangement.
Yeah. Yeah. To understand this, I think you need to go back to the basics and say, why do we have firms at all? That's like a basic economics question. Why do we have firms? It's because of transactional costs. Every time you want something done, to try to find the right person to do it, the right company to do it, etc., that's very costly, that's very inefficient. So that's why you have a company, try to bundle together the people you need to produce something. Sometimes it grows too big, you try to bundle a lot of people together, it would be more efficient actually to split up, and sometimes it's too small, but that's why you have a company. What happens when you have digital platforms is that this transactional cost is lowered. So it's easier, much easier to find the right person for the right job. It doesn't go down to zero. It's not like that the traditional firm will disappear in the upcoming years. It's still, I mean, if I have a company that does more or less the same thing year after year, I will need a certain fixed staff to do most of those things. Then sometimes I need flexibility, and I will hire a contractor to do those things. But I mean, in that way, I think a lot, and also from the employee's point of view, it's quite nice to actually know what income you will have next month, to know that you have a place to go to that gives you some sort of meaning and structure.
Also that you're insured.
You're insured.
Social security
colleagues,
is different.
For example. I think it's quite nice to have colleagues. It depends on how social you are, of course. So, I mean, this is not going to disappear, but there's definitely a shift here. When the transactional costs for finding the right person for the right job is lower, you will want to be more flexible. You don't need those big firms where you employ everyone that is needed for the production. So sure, there's a shift going on. And how should that be handled? I arranged a panel discussion with representatives from the technological companies in Sweden and representatives from the labor unions, and they were very positive. Oh, we'll find a solution here. This will be like, sure, that some of those people are somewhere between employed and that they have their own companies, they're self-employed, there's something different. But we'll find solutions here. They should also be unionized, etc., etc. That sounds positive. On the other hand, of course, of course they would say this, because it was like this was the organizations or the labor market, and they're used to finding those solutions. It might be that we find those solutions, and I know that, I mean, Austria is a heavily unionized country as well. Maybe we'll find those solutions, but in other countries it's not like that. So I don't think this will be, even if, I'm not even sure that we will find those solutions, and even if we find them, they might not all suit other countries. So you will have to really find your way here, find that there's something new happening here, and you need to find the regulations to actually have like insurance, etc. So different countries, depending on their different traditions, will have to find their own solutions.
Niko, do you have something pressing to say before we launch the Q&A?
Pressing? Not really. I mean, I just wanted to respond to your statement here. I think one possible solution is, of course, to sort of disentangle maybe social security from the actual payment of labor in some way. Don't have a concrete idea here, I'm not an expert here, but I think that's also a way to go, because if you see these as two different things that don't necessarily have to be combined, you're a lot more flexible. And you said Austria is a heavily unionized country, true, but also it's relatively easy to lay people off still. And the easier it is for a company to lay people off, the easier it is for a company to hire people, of course. So, and that is very often forgotten in Austria due to ideology, of course. But if you look to other countries where it's almost impossible to lay people off again, and of course you think a lot of actually hiring these people on a basically lifelong contract, and can't get rid of them again, no matter how good they are or not. So yeah, that is a problem, and that certainly has to change in some way.
I would say with this we open it to the audience. Are there any questions for the panel? I think we'll get a mic. Yeah.
Good evening, and thanks very much. Josef Lynch, Director Neoslab. I have two questions for Martina. The one thing you mentioned is the digital single market, that we still don't have it. So my question would be, when will we have it? What are the steps, and you know, what is your expectation for 2018 and 19? And related to that, you mentioned that one still needs 28 licenses to operate in the European Union. Now soon that will be 27 due to Brexit. Now the Brits are always being mentioned as kind of champions of lighter regulation. And so my second question would be, would you expect with the Brits leaving that becoming more difficult, and actually that Liberals will have to fight with even more fervor to get some light touch regulation and not heavy regulation in the European Union? Thanks.
Would you like to respond?
Very good questions, and very difficult, both of them. First, when we will have the digital single market, well, I am afraid that it's still one of the highest priority for European Union, but I'm afraid that there are other priorities right now on the plate, like Brexit, like common security, common asylum system. We are really talking about so many little bit more urgent things that I'm quite afraid that this will not be like the real priority for the political decisions. And next to it, we have all elections in the autumn. My country, your country, Germany, of course. And I think this is influencing a lot the discussion in all European institutions. And what we achieved, for example, with the roaming 10 days ago, 12 days ago, this was a big achievement on digital single market. So everybody is happy about that, and it was a fight which started maybe 10 years ago. So you can imagine how long these processes. But I think that all politicians, they understand it. They understand that the digital single market is something that will help. The Commissioner Ansip, who I am seeing next week in Strasbourg, maybe he will give us some good news. He is pushing a lot on it. So let's hope that this will be the priority. But I am not like the most optimistic person that it will be like the first thing to do right now. And the better regulation and Brits. Well, I was going before to react very quickly what you said about the social security, and this is connected to your question, because I think that at the end what we will need as solutions will be both ideas from the right side of political spectrum and both ideas from the left side of political spectrum. Left side is proposing to have this universal income, to have healthcare system and social system not so linked to the employment. These are more ideas from the left side of political spectrum. And the right side is saying better regulation, less regulation, better conditions for doing business. And this is something that we will need somehow to connect. So, which is, politically speaking, this is good that we can find solution between more ideas from different sides. We will miss Brits in this respect a lot, because there are really those who are very pragmatical, who are pushing better regulation. I see it in concrete legislation proposals in the parliament. When there are Brits in the middle, it's always a big push on better regulation. So I think we should, as quickly as possible, learn from them and use some examples they have, like they are using this rule, if one new law is approved, other two laws should be abolished because to keep always the balance and to go towards the less regulation. So this is something that we should really learn from them, and we will miss them in this respect, absolutely. And not talking about budgetary issues, because on digitalization, innovation, research, Brits are really the champions. So I'm curious what will happen there, because British universities are on all research and innovation projects. 5 out of 10 projects have as a lead partner British universities. And I think that even in this reasoning and this research of new framework, we will miss them. Not very optimistic answers, sorry.
If I could just comment on that, I would say that sure, there's reason to be a pessimist there for UK leaving. It's also worrisome with populist parties, big in many countries, usually quite anti-market, anti-globalization and so on. At the same time, you should observe that liberal movements are actually, I mean, liberal parties are actually doing quite well in Europe at the same time. So we've had good election results in the Netherlands, for example. I mean, France, this is a huge change. There's always been, I mean, even though it's been right or left, they've always been etatists. I mean, they love the big state, the big government. But this is really something new we see here. Also in Sweden, actually, it's looking quite good in the polls. And I think there are like 7 out of 28 prime ministers in the EU are actually liberals. Which is a quite good number, I mean, if you see it historically. So we should, I mean, sure, there are reasons to worry, but there are also like some beacons of hope.
More questions from the audience?
Actually, I would step in. Since we've talked about transformation and we need to foster innovation, and we need to be open and flexible. Since I'm working here at the NEAS lab on labor and social welfare, I'm thinking about how do we get a new form of skill management, actually. If you need to be flexible, if you need to learn quite often quite fast skills, how do you do that? Do we have the structure right now? Since education is regulated in 28 different ways, do we really have the framework and the skill set to be to foster innovative people, to give them the right tools to be creative, to create jobs, to be successful all over the world?
Maybe that goes to you, because since you are also in touch with Why Not, I think it's called, right? Where you have been.
Well, yeah, but maybe the most important thing that last week was approved my report in the Parliament, New Skills Agenda. I was the reporter for the Parliament, and it was very interesting work because it's something that the Commission presented, and we tried to even make it a little bit more open in the Parliament. And what is interesting, there are, let's say, one first learning from that. Both Committee on Education and Committee on Employment in the Parliament were involved, which is the first time in the history. And for me, this is like a very big satisfaction because it means that we cannot talk about education if we don't talk about perspective of employment, and we cannot speak about employment if we don't include education. So this is something very important which never happened before because it seemed like two different words when it comes to new ideas, new proposals of legislation. So this New Skills Agenda has mainly couple of important issues. First is strengthening cooperation between education and businesses and industry, which is something that Austria, for example, is doing very well. Austria has been always example for everybody on this, because there is very good connection between labor market and the education system. So education system can be in touch with the reality, can know what is really happening in the real market, and can know what are the needs of future skills for the labor market. And this can be done only if there is a connection between employers and education system. So this is first thing you will find in this New Skills Agenda. The second thing, it's what are the new skills? And the first are the digital skills, for sure, because we all know that in next 10 years, 90% of all jobs will need digital skills, some kind of digital skills, different levels, but 90% of jobs will need digital skills. So this is how we adapt the education system to this new need of digital skills. But one big issue we are mentioning in this report are so-called soft skills, which I am always laughing to call them soft skills because they are the hardest to get, but we call them soft, but they are the hardest to get. And these soft skills are mainly flexibility, what you mentioned, flexibility, adaptability, critical thinking, analytic thinking, and work in team working, and all this kind of soft skills. So this is something that we already put in the agenda. And what is interesting, some colleagues were asking to have a real learning in school and a real education program for these soft skills, which would be something new, which in some countries is there already, but in some countries is still missing. The third big thing are entrepreneurial skills. And we talked about it before, it's very tricky because sometimes we as liberals are accused that we would like everybody to do business. But having entrepreneurial skills and teaching entrepreneurship in schools doesn't mean only to do business. It means to have entrepreneurial approach in life. So I'm always saying to everybody, you can see if a teacher is entrepreneurial or he's not, if a politician is entrepreneurial or he's not. It's just the approach to life. It's something that we should really develop in our young people. And the last point, which I still see missing in Europe, it's sharing best practices. Since we have this 28 labor market, 28 educational systems, there are something which is working very well, something which is not. We should look at countries where they have a very good system of cooperation between education and employment. We should see some concrete projects in education, and this sharing best practices, it's still missing in Europe. So this is what we are thinking from the Parliament point of view about new skills and new way of education. And what we really think that we should start immediately to change education. Because you can imagine that you will see the changes in 10, 15 years if you start now, because education process is so long. So it's something that we should start immediately. looking at the new digital skills and new companies and new needs of the new companies?
From an automation perspective, I would really like to stress the soft skills, because what you see that computers and robots are getting better and better at is really quite complex skills in the workplace, as you might learn in vocational training. It's really those traditional educational things as law, engineering, medicine, and so on. Computers are really getting better there. You soon, actually already now, you can actually get better diagnosis from a computer than from a human doctor. So I mean, this is really, that's really where computers are getting better. What humans still are the best at, and will be for a long time in the future, is like leadership, entertainment, teaching, services, like person-to-person service in restaurants or whatever. I mean, those are the sectors. And this is really not something that you learn in traditional education. I mean, neither in vocational training nor in universities. So this is really something we need to open our eyes for, because we've seen this as something like some inherent talent. Some people are service-minded, some people are good leaders, and to a certain extent it is like that. Some people are really good teachers and so on. But to a certain extent you can also learn those capabilities, those skills.
May I have one question? What do you think, guys, about emotional skills? Yeah. I just read a couple of interesting articles recently that this is a new tendency for the future, since digitalization and automatization and robots and artificial intelligence could replace some of works you mentioned, that something that we will really need to develop will be emotional skills.
It might be. On the other hand, it's quite interesting to see some of the sectors where computers are doing better and better are a bit surprising. For example, therapy. It's actually, I mean, in Sweden we've done several experiments where some sorts of therapy for people with depression and anxiety is actually better done if you do it at your home with a computer. So it's actually an app or a computer, because people actually are more free to express themselves and so on, and to follow this program by a computer. If they sit with a real human therapist, they actually often, I don't know, they get bogged down in long discussions about their past or whatever, but it's actually more efficient therapy if you do it with a computer. And there are several other interesting examples like that, where actually a computer can be quite good at understanding when a human is upset, and instead of becoming upset itself, as a human being might be, the computer doesn't get upset. It instead has a good strategy to try to calm the situation down. So it's in experimental things with like computerized help desks and so on. Actually, computers can sometimes be better at handling aggressive situations and so on than human beings. So, I mean, it sounds obvious that human beings are better at emotional skills than computers, but I was a bit surprised here as myself to learn that it's not really obvious.
Niko, I might jump in then. If you could paint the situation in Austria in, say, 50 years, the very ideal situation, the very ideal outcome for you, in broad strokes, what would that be?
50 years.
that's take 40 or 60.
Let's make it 50 months or so. Like if we stick to the topic, I mean, I think we do need new and precise regulations regarding employment. There's there is steps to be taken. There is various different types of employment and work and freelance work in place already, which is not reflected in laws at the moment, and that has to be changed. I mean, if we come back to startups, as you said, they are indeed on the radar, but that doesn't mean that the regulations are that there are good regulations in place. There are not. We need also new types of companies. I mean, that's especially an Austrian problem. We do have the good old limited company, but that also has ripened to a certain age, and that should be changed. I mean, we do have a big problem of letting employees participate in the company where they are employed. So we need easier models of like employee stock options programs, or at least types of models where you can acquire some sort of sweat equity if you work for a company. That is almost impossible here. I mean, there's various types of integrating entrepreneurial thinking in people that are employed into companies if you let them participate. I mean, there's a whole range of small things that can be done here that would facilitate modern ways of working together.
Mm-hmm. One last question from my side, maybe. Do you think that faster and quicker and more adapted regulation also is a question of maybe bottom up rather than only top down? So if citizens actively ask for, better regulation to be in place, would politics work quicker?
I mean, they are asking for it all the time. I mean, the thing is, are they heard? I mean, from the startup scene that I know very well, they are drafting political programs. They have very specific needs, and they're able to articulate them. But the thing is, are they heard?
So yeah, that's.
We're actually now, during the summer, publishing a report about an experiment done in the UK about exactly this. They tried a thing with like crowdsourcing. How should we get rid of red tape, as they say? So they had this internet site where people should so they had a different subject for different weeks, and now please get all your best, come with all your best ideas of how to loosen regulation in this field and so on. And it really was a failure. It really was hard to get it to work. Me and Josef actually had a discussion about how you get discussions like this to work within a party. And it's actually quite hard to have those. You think, oh, we have those digital tools now, we can have great discussions on the internet and so on. It was really hard to get it to work. They thought they would get lots of smart suggestions from private enterprises all over the country and so on about how to loosen regulations, but that's not really what happened. Mm-hmm. So they tried to create a system for a bottom-up approach, but it didn't work. I'm not saying that it could never work, but it's probably harder than you think to have it. A lot of the time people actually look to themselves. They say, oh, I want to get rid of this and this regulation, that would be good for me. Yeah, okay, sure, that would be good for you, but that wouldn't be a functioning system. So it's not really easy to get very good things from a bottom-up approach. But you could try.
Well, as a liberal, I have always this big decision in front of me. If we need really rules for everything, which I don't think, or if we should just let it be and let the market figure it out, which is like my first take, like the liberal market. But I think that in these big changes we are going through now, the answer is somewhere in between. Mm. We have to find a balance between these two. We have to be very careful, and I would focus most on better regulation, on less administrative burden, removal of barriers and national requirements that prevent the real single market, and just to facilitate the work. And so this would be the regulation I would do, to facilitate the work for not only the traditional companies, traditional work, but for new platforms and new digital works. What we will absolutely need, this is the second thing, and there I would like to see some little bit more push from the political level. We will need enough skilled people. People who will be flexible enough to adapt to this changing environment. And for the labor market, as was mentioned by all of us somehow, for the labor market we should be more open, and we should not stick on the rules of 100 years ago. because the labor market is so much changing that we have really to change the rules and the way of working, and flexible way of working, and even labor contracts will change, I think, very soon if we will help this change. So probably the main word today would be adaptability and flexibility.
I think with that we can, if there are no more questions from the audience, we can conclude this panel. And on behalf of the NEOS Lab, I have the pleasure to invite you to the refreshments are prepared over there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here.